The curtain never rises the same way twice. Once, it opened to reveal children who did not yet know what it meant to be watched by millions. Their laughter was rehearsed, but still real, their joy coaxed by directors who promised them the world. They were held up as emblems of hope, of innocence untouched. America adored them, not as people, but as shining mirrors of the youth everyone longed to hold on to. She smiled for the camera and cried when it turned away. That was the price of being young in Hollywood. The light adored you, but only while you stayed small enough to fit into its narrow frame. They became darlings of a weary nation, offering comfort through depression, through war, through long nights when the audience needed to forget. The role made her famous. It also broke her. Because what is a role? When it ends just as life is beginning. Childhood was the shortest script ever written, and when their voices deepened, when their faces lengthened, when the sweet wonder in their eyes was replaced by something wiser, the applause softened. They clapped when she entered the room, but no one noticed when she left. Some found their way into the second act, luminous adults who redefined themselves, legends who transcended the fragile years of youth. But for most, the spotlight dimmed in silence. No one dared ask. She never told. Until it was too late. They became teachers, soldiers, librarians, parents, ordinary roles that carried no headlines, but carried weight nonetheless. Their names stayed on posters, but not on the lips of those they loved. Tonight, we remember them, not as footnotes, not as vanished novelties, but as the beating heart of a bygone era. The camera preserved their laughter, but time preserved their humanity. And so we begin, with 15 lights that once dazzled the screen, before slipping quietly into memory. She was a child who carried a nation on her shoulders, though she never knew it. In the breadlines and broken streets of the Depression, her curls shone brighter than the nickel that bought a movie ticket. She smiled for the camera, and cried when it turned away. The audience never saw the weight in her tiny chest, the way the grown-ups whispered about money while she rehearsed another dance. Presidents praised her as if she were policy. Soldiers tucked her photograph into breast pockets beside letters from home. She was not just entertainment, she was a promise that life, no matter how cruel, could still hold sweetness. But promises grow older. Tap shoes gather dust. The studio wanted Shirley the child. It had no use for Shirley the woman. She searched for herself beyond the lens. The role made her famous. It also broke her. In the silence after the applause, she discovered diplomacy, motherhood, and a dignity Hollywood had never offered her. Still, to millions, she remained frozen at 6, forever winking, forever singing. They clapped when she entered the room, but no one noticed when she left. The screen flickered, and there he was, a small boy with eyes that could unravel even the hardest hearts. In The Kid, Charlie Chaplin held him, and the world forgot it was watching a film. Jackie Coogan did not perform innocence, he embodied it. His tears were real, his laughter unforced, his presence so natural that audiences believed him to be their own child, offered up on the altar of cinema. She smiled for the camera, and cried when it turned away. Jackie did not cry. He made the world cry. Hollywood rewarded him with riches, with fame, with a childhood dressed in velvet and spotlight. Yet childhood does not last, and neither did fortune. When Jackie grew, when the boy's magic could no longer be staged, he discovered the cruelest betrayal. The millions he had earned were gone, spent by the parents who had once guided him onto the stage. The role made him famous. It also broke him. From heartbreak, though, came legacy. Jackie fought back, and the world listened. The Coogan Law was born, a safeguard for all children who would walk into the same dazzling, dangerous light. He was the boy who made the world cry, and then quietly, the man who made it kinder. She was small, fragile-looking, yet carried the emotional weight of an entire audience in her eyes. Margaret O'Brien was Hollywood's little tragedian, a child who could summon tears so pure they seemed to rise from some secret well of sorrow. In Meet Me in St. Louis, standing beside Judy Garland, her trembling lip and quivering gaze could make a theatre full of strangers silently reach for handkerchiefs. She smiled for the camera and cried when it turned away. Her gift was not performance, it was truth, wrapped in the fragile body of a child. But childhood is a fleeting script. The roles that once seemed written for her became harder to find. As adolescence reshaped her face, the industry turned away, unable to reconcile the delicate child with the young woman emerging in her place. The role made her famous. It also broke her. Not in scandal, not in disgrace, simply in the gentle, inevitable way a season ends. Margaret O'Brien never chased the spotlight, never begged for it to return. She let it fade, leaving behind performances so delicate that even now, decades later, they linger like a ghostly melody. Some stars vanish not because they fall, but because they choose silence over applause. He walked onto the screen as if he had been born from another century, a boy with manners too perfect for the ragged world outside the theatre doors. In short pants and polished shoes, Freddie Bartholomew looked less like a child and more like a promise of what childhood could be. Gentle, noble, unspoiled. Mothers adored him, directors leaned on him, and boys who envied him could not help but watch in awe. He carried entire films, and yet when the lights went out, he carried something heavier. Expectations no child should bear. He smiled for the camera and cried when it turned away. Behind the velvet diction and silver voice, lawsuits raged like storms. Family members tore at his earnings, pulling apart not just his fortune but his innocence. The role made him famous. It also broke him. He wore knickers on screen, but in real life he wore the weariness of betrayal. Time was not kind. Elegance ages poorly in a town addicted to novelty. He worked, yes, but the applause had already drifted to fresher faces. They clapped when he entered the room. But no one noticed when he left. From the first time she stepped before the camera, Natalie Wood carried eyes too knowing for her age. In Miracle on 34th Street, she was still a child, yet her gaze seemed to hold secrets beyond playgrounds and dolls. She played innocence, yes, but it was innocence already brushed with wisdom, as though she sensed that childhood would not last long. She smiled for the camera and cried when it turned away. Hollywood noticed. By her teens, Natalie was no longer the precocious girl, but a young woman cast in roles of heartbreak and romance. The studio system moved her quickly, almost ruthlessly, from little girl dresses into gowns and eyeliner. The role made her famous. It also broke her. For while the world adored her, Natalie herself had hardly paused to live the childhood she was portraying only years before. She did not vanish like other child stars. Her transformation was her vanishing. The girl audiences once cherished simply grew into another figure altogether, luminous, magnetic, and tragically brief. They clapped when she entered the room, but no one noticed when she left. Natalie Wood's child years slipped into memory, replaced by a woman who would forever burn too brightly, too soon. He arrived in Hollywood with eyes too tender for the world he would inherit. Roddy McDowall, delicate, precise, with a voice that carried both childhood and centuries past, became the boy who reminded audiences of what was worth saving. In How Green Was My Valley, his gaze alone seemed to lift grief from the screen, as though purity could be captured in a child's silence. She smiled for the camera and cried when it turned away. For Roddy, it was different. He gave his tears freely to the story, yet held back his own. The role made him famous. It also broke him. For how could any child continue to be a symbol of innocence once time began its inevitable work? He grew taller, his voice deepened, and Hollywood did not know where to place him. Not quite a hero, not quite a boy, he drifted into spaces where the spotlight no longer reached. They clapped when he entered the room, but no one noticed when he left. Still, he never abandoned the craft. Behind the camera, among reels and shadows, he kept telling stories, not for fame, but for love. If Shirley Temple was Hollywood's golden cherub, Jane Withers was its mischievous angel. The girl with a spark in her eyes and a grin that promised trouble. She was bold, saucy, a little whirlwind of sass who made audiences laugh at a time when laughter was medicine. Unlike Shirley's sweetness, Jane brought bite. She smiled for the camera and cried when it turned away, though only rarely, for her childhood was spent convincing the world that mischief itself was magic. But Hollywood was not a playground with room for two eternal children. Shirley Temple's shadow loomed large, and Jane's glow, though bright, was often compared and diminished. Still, she danced through her youth with a kind of fearless energy, stealing scenes with a wink, a laugh, a stubborn tilt of her chin. The role made her famous. It also broke her. As she grew older, the demand for her spunky little girl image faded, and scripts stopped arriving at her door. They clapped when she entered the room, but no one noticed when she left. Yet Jane Withers did not vanish entirely. She reinvented herself, found new paths, and carried on with dignity. Still, the golden years of her childhood lingered only in reels, a reminder that even mischief, once adored, eventually quiets into memory. She was the girl who could outthink the villains, outshine the grown-ups, and still look as though butter wouldn't melt in her mouth. Benita Granville became Nancy Drew before Nancy Drew was legend, eye sharp, voice quick, wit sharper still. Audiences loved her contradictions, innocence wrapped in cunning, sweetness laced with steel. In her, Hollywood found a child who could carry secrets and reveal them with a smile. She smiled for the camera and cried when it turned away. For Benita, the stage door opened early, but it closed just as fast. The role made her famous. It also broke her, for once she grew older, directors no longer wanted cleverness in a girl. They wanted glamour, softness, surrender. Her sharpness became her exile. Behind the camera, she carved out a life in production, a quiet success that history rarely writes about. But, in the minds of those who remembered, she was still forever Nancy Drew, the girl detective who seemed capable of solving anything. And yet, the cruelest mystery was her own. They clapped when she entered the room, but no one noticed when she left. For a golden stretch of Hollywood history, Mickey Rooney was the boy who never seemed to rest. He danced, he sang, he laughed until entire theaters vibrated with joy. Studios called on him for everything, and he delivered, film after film, role after role, a spark of boundless energy that made him for a time the biggest star in the world. She smiled for the camera and cried when it turned away. Mickey smiled too, but his grin was work, his pace relentless, as though he feared what silence might bring. On screen he was the eternal boy, mischief in his step, innocence in his eyes. But the years did not pause for him. As he grew, the roles that once defined him no longer fit. His boyishness clung too tightly, even as adulthood pressed in. The role made him famous. It also broke him. He wore tuxedos on screen. In real life, he wore guilt. Mickey Rooney never vanished, not truly. His name lingered. His work stretched across decades. But the child who once embodied pure joy had long since slipped away. Sometimes the brightest flame does not burn out. It simply transforms into something unrecognizable. Her voice was a lantern in the dark years of war. Deanna Durbin, still a teenager, sang with a richness that seemed borrowed from angels, too full, too knowing, too consoling for her tender age. She was not just Universal's greatest treasure, she was the melody that made weary nations pause, if only for a moment, to believe again. Soldiers carried her records, mothers clutched her songs, and children fell asleep to her voice, as though it were a lullaby written only for them. She smiled for the camera and cried when it turned away. The role made her famous. It also broke her. For what the world adored, she did not. Studios demanded more light, more charm, more songs, but what Deanna wanted was quiet. They clapped when she entered the room, but no one noticed when she left. And when she did, she left for good. No scandal, no disgrace, just choice. She walked away from Hollywood and built a life of her own in Europe, where neighbors knew her not as a star, but as a woman who had chosen peace. The audience believed the song, but she preferred the silence. Before sound filled the theaters, silence was enough, and in that silence, baby Peggy reigned. Barely more than a toddler, she carried films that drew millions, her tiny expressions capable of both laughter and heartbreak. Her face appeared everywhere, on toys, books, advertisements, as if the whole world had borrowed her childhood for its amusement. She smiled for the camera and cried when it turned away. For a brief, dazzling moment, she was as famous as Chaplin himself. But the arrival of sound was not kind. Her voice, her charm, her silent era magic, all at once they were deemed obsolete. By the time she reached adulthood, the fortune she had earned was gone, mismanaged into dust. The role made her famous. It also broke her. They clapped when she entered the room, but no one noticed when she left. Yet Peggy did not disappear entirely. She endured. She lived long enough to tell her own story, to reclaim her name, to remind the world that behind the doll-like face was a woman who had survived the very industry that once adored her. The baby who had everything lived long enough to outlast it all. Once she was baby Peggy, a toddler whose face flickered across silent screens, earning fortunes before she could even spell her name. Audiences laughed, cried, and gasped at her antics, never realizing that behind those wide eyes was a child too young to understand the weight of stardom. She smiled for the camera and cried when it turned away. The role made her famous. It also broke her, for when the lights dimmed, the industry discarded her as swiftly as it had discovered her. But unlike so many who vanished, she endured. Years later, she shed the stage name and stepped into herself as Diana Sarah Carey. No longer the little girl in costumes, she became the woman who wrote, who remembered, who warned. Her pen turned pain into history, reclaiming the narrative Hollywood had stolen. They clapped when she entered the room, but no one noticed when she left, until she returned with her own words, her own truth. Her story was not one of tragedy, but of transformation. The child who once lived as a commodity grew into a guardian of memory. The audience believed the performance, but she believed in survival. Before she became the tragic woman with a voice that shook the heavens, Judy Garland was only a child with a voice soft as trembling silk. She sang of rainbows, of dreams, of tomorrows brighter than the present, and the world leaned in to listen. Even in her youngest years, her notes carried an ache too deep for innocence, as though she had been born already knowing sorrow. She smiled for the camera and cried when it turned away. Hollywood, dazzled by her gift, wanted everything. They pushed her into rehearsals that stretched into exhaustion, pressed diet pills into her hands, demanded that her childhood be rehearsed, perfected, staged. The role made her famous. It also broke her. The little girl who sang of hope was never truly given the chance to live it. They clapped when she entered the room, but no one noticed when she left. Judy Garland grew into legend, luminous, fragile, unforgettable. But the child within her remained trapped, silenced beneath the weight of expectation. Her story is not only one of beauty, but of sorrow entwined, a rainbow forever shadowed by storm. Her eyes were not simply blue, they were said to be violet, a shade so rare it seemed borrowed from myth. Elizabeth Taylor, a girl with beauty too luminous for her age, first appeared as though the camera itself had been waiting for her. In National Velvet, she was sincerity made flesh, tender, unpolished, and breathtakingly real. She smiled for the camera and cried when it turned away. But unlike so many others, she did not fade when childhood ended. The role made her famous. It also broke her, for Hollywood refused to let her linger in girlhood. By her teens, she was already sculpted into a symbol of womanhood, her innocence stripped away and replaced with allure. The transformation was merciless, yet irresistible. She wore riding boots on screen, but in real life, she wore the expectations of a world determined to make her older, sooner. They clapped when she entered the room, but no one noticed when the child was gone. What remained was a woman, radiant, complicated, unforgettable. Elizabeth Taylor's story is not disappearance, but metamorphosis. The audience believed the girl, but they never stopped worshipping the woman she became. She was Disney's golden girl, Hayley Mills, with her bright eyes and unshakable warmth. In Pollyanna, she taught a generation how to find gladness, and in The Parent Trap, she split herself into two, convincing audiences that innocence itself could be multiplied. Her British charm was effortless, her sweetness genuine, never cloying. She smiled for the camera and cried when it turned away. For a time, Hollywood believed she could carry their brightest dreams. But childhood is the briefest of contracts, and the industry that had crowned her darling could not imagine her grown. Scripts that once poured in began to falter. The role made her famous. It also broke her. They clapped when she entered the room, but no one noticed when she left. Hayley did not collapse into scandal or fade in disgrace. Instead, she slipped gently from the glare into a quieter life, a woman no longer divided into doubles, no longer confined to innocence. Her story lingers like a soft afterimage. The girl who once played two sisters on screen became, in the end, just one woman, living gracefully beyond the dream. 15 faces, 15 voices. For a moment in history, they were everything. They danced across screens with the lightness of dreams, sang with the urgency of hope, and carried entire nations on shoulders far too small for such weight. In Depression breadlines, in wartime barracks, in quiet living rooms where families gathered around a glowing screen, they were there. A girl's tap shoes brighter than hunger, a boy's gentle accent softer than grief, a voice so pure it made strangers believe tomorrow would be worth waking for. They smiled for the camera and cried when it turned away. The roles made them famous. They also broke them. Childhood in Hollywood was not childhood at all, but labor dressed in sequins, applause that demanded more, and contracts that forgot how fragile a child's heart could be. Yet, despite the weight, they gave us themselves, and in giving, they became part of us. But time is merciless, the quietest thief. The curls loosen, the voices deepen, the faces change. The machine that once adored them discards them, searching for the next miracle, the next child to wear the burden of innocence. Some stars tried to stay, clawing at the edges of relevance. Others slipped away willingly, retreating into family, into study, into silence. Some left behind only fragments, a single song, a single role, a photograph taped to a soldier's mirror. They clapped when these children entered the room, but no one noticed when they left, and yet they endure, not as gossip, not as relics, but as memory. Watch National Velvet, and Elizabeth Taylor is still 13, forever luminous. Hear Deanna Durbin's voice, and the war is not yet won, but hope feels possible. Glimpse Shirley Temple's dimples, and suddenly the depression seems less crushing, as though joy itself once intervened. Film does not age, not in the way we do. The audience believed the performance, but the reel goes on, long after the child has grown old, long after the applause has faded into silence. There is danger in memory. It beautifies, it erases pain, it keeps us from seeing the fractures that lay beneath the gloss. But there is also mercy. To remember them is to honor them, to admit that they mattered, that they carried us, even if it cost them. Their vanishing reminds us of our own fragility, that nothing, not even magic, lasts untouched. That childhood, no matter how dazzling, cannot be preserved. Still, memory offers something Hollywood never could: gentleness. We can choose to see them not as commodities, not as curiosities, but as children who bore an impossible burden and still found a way to shine. Some disappeared completely, shadows swallowed by time. Others reinvented themselves, diplomats, historians, mothers, men who loved the art enough to remain in its service, even from behind the lens. Each one became something beyond the screen. So tonight, as their names flicker like constellations across the sky of cinema, we remember Shirley, Freddie, Roddy, Benita, Deanna, Diana, Elizabeth, and all the others whose stories are threaded between. Faint now, yes, but still burning, still reaching us across the dark. The dangerous beauty of memory is that it deceives us into thinking they never left. Perhaps in some way they never did. For every time we press play, every time a frame lights up a screen, the children return. They live again, untouched, eternal. And when the lights go down and silence fills the room, they leave us with something more enduring than applause, the reminder that we once believed in forever